You're kneeling in sand, your knees burn, an iron collar bites into the back of your neck, and a rusted chain drags across the dunes, linking you to 11 other women. A man with a sharp eye lifts your chin, examines your teeth, looks at the calluses on your hands, listens for the story your posture tells. Around you, the wind carries only the sound of camels and the distant scrape of traders marking names in ledgers that will mean you are no longer counted by the people who loved you. This is not a single moment, but a way of life spread over centuries, and what it did to women like you, to their bodies, and to everything those bodies represented, was a violence that aimed not merely to end a life, but to erase the possibility of a lineage, a language, a remembered name. We start here because the particular cruelty of this history is easiest to feel in the sand and iron, an intimacy of suffering that becomes a blueprint for disappearance. The Atlantic slave trade is better known in global memory. Its ships, plantations, and diasporic descendants are visible in museums, monuments, and communities. But between roughly the 7th and the 20th centuries, another slave trade moved millions across different oceans and deserts, across the Sahara, up the Nile, down the Swahili coast into the Indian Ocean, and it left far fewer public traces. Historians estimate that between about 14 and 17 million Africans were removed by what we often call the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean, or Arab slave trades. Why is much of that human cost almost invisible to us now? Because this system was built in deliberate and structural ways to make people disappear. If this subject matters to you and you want more buried histories uncovered, hit like and subscribe. To understand how this erasure worked, we must widen the lens. The trade extended over more than a millennium and across a vast geography. Men and women taken from the Sahel and savannas of West Africa, from the lakes and forests of Central Africa, from the Horn, and from East African shores. They were marched north to markets along caravans that crossed the Sahara, ferried down rivers to Mediterranean ports, or carried by dhow to the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and the islands of the Indian Ocean. The buyers and users were diverse: household masters and governors in cities like Cairo and Constantinople, plantation and agricultural elites, military patrons who prized eunuchs for palace service, and private households in places that ranged from the Ottoman court to coastal Zanzibar. The trade evolved over centuries, adapting to shifting demands, political changes, and new technologies. It was not a single uniform machine, but its patterns were consistent enough to cause a profound and specific kind of loss. Numbers here must be handled with care. Scholars offer ranges rather than exact totals. Different routes and centuries show different intensities. Even so, the order of magnitude is staggering. Historians place the number of people taken across Sahara and Indian Ocean networks into the low tens of millions. That scale matters because it is the precondition for erasure at a societal level. When large numbers of people, and crucially their reproductive futures, are removed or controlled, entire lines of descent and memory can be interrupted or absorbed into other societies. This is a different tragedy from the violence of death. It is the violence of being made to vanish within living communities. How did that happen, in practical terms? The answer lies in commerce, in the cold arithmetic of caravans and markets. Traders calculated profit against risk and loss. Camels were expensive, supplies were precarious, desert crossings could kill. So the value of a captive was weighed against the cost of moving them, feeding them, and the returns they would generate on arrival. This calculus informed cruel decisions. Who would survive the march? Who would be sold at the next trading post? Who would be kept for household labor? And who would be targeted for removal of reproductive capacity? African intermediaries were central to this system. Long before a captive reached Mediterranean or Arabian buyers, local networks, warlords, raiding parties, rival kingdoms, and market brokers played roles in capture, consolidation, and transport. Firearms, textiles, metals, and salt were common items in exchange for human beings. The famous phrase, "guns for people," is shorthand for a set of relationships that encouraged some African rulers and merchants to participate. That participation must be understood historically. Trade made rulers wealthy, strengthened states, and sometimes secured political advantages in volatile regions. Yet that economic incentive also made slavery an embedded institution, not merely the outcome of episodic violence. Caravans were economies unto themselves.
A column of merchants, camels, and captives had to be provisioned, each human being added to logistical complexity. In many accounts across centuries, the needs of the caravan shaped treatment. Buyers wanted fit captives on arrival. Sick, injured, or otherwise compromised people were often abandoned or killed on the road. Primary sources record the sight of bones along paths and the smell of death in oases. Medical care was minimal. Mortality rates for long desert treks were high, and women, already exposed to trauma, often suffered additional danger because they were trafficked for purposes that required them to be alive and productive at the point of sale. The Sahara itself was an instrument of selection. Crossing it demanded endurance beyond imagination, weeks of heat, thirst, and hunger. Eyewitnesses who traversed the routes in the 19th century wrote of skeletal remains and of caravans moving in grim procession.
One European observer who traveled in the region described camps where bones lay visible and where the living moved past the dead as if survival required a hardening of feeling. Such accounts are the testimonies historians use to estimate the mortality rates of these crossings. They do not capture every life lost, but they do indicate a system that accepted, indeed planned for, substantial loss of human life as a cost of commerce. Inside markets, people were categorized with the same brutal efficiency used in other slave trades, but the categories mattered in different ways. Men were often evaluated for strength, skills, and suitability for labor or military service. Women were inspected for youth, fertility, and domestic skills. Buyers looked at teeth to estimate age and health. They examined hands and feet for work capacity. They questioned for linguistic background if they sought a servant who could serve in a particular household. Crucially, the primary commodity many buyers sought in women was reproductive possibility. Women could be household servants, concubines, or wives. They could also bear children who would be raised within the buyer's family and society. That meant women's bodies were sites where lineage could be redirected. This is where the system's twofold machinery of erasure, biological and cultural, intersected. For men, one of the most devastating practices was castration. Primary sources, including contemporary accounts by travelers and administrators, report castration as a widespread, systematic practice in certain markets and regions. Castration served multiple functions for slaveholders. Eunuchs could be trusted with the inner sanctums of palaces and harems. They were posed as non-threatening servants, which conferred social utility under certain regimes. And castration made it impossible for those men to sire children whose identities would persist in the same way. The procedure was often carried out under brutal conditions. Mortality rates were high. Every castration was a direct attack on a man's ability to continue his family line, and when performed on large numbers of men, it produced demographic effects that rippled through generations. It was a form of biological erasure engineered to remove male reproductive capacity from particular populations. We must be careful in describing technique or instrumentation. Explicit procedural detail adds little to understanding and risks sensationalism. The essential historical fact is that castration occurred sufficiently frequently to be recorded across many accounts, and that it carried both immediate and long-term consequences. Immediate in the form of death or disability, long-term in the disappearance of male descendants and the fracturing of familial continuity.
Historians trace these effects across regions where demand for eunuchs was high, noting skewed gender ratios and the absence of patrilineal descendants in certain communities, a demographic echo of the violence. Women, meanwhile, were often kept precisely because their fertility could be commodified. A woman taken to a harem or household might find herself living under constant surveillance, subject to the sexual demands of her owner, assigned domestic labor, and stripped of her original kinship ties. A legal category found in several Islamic legal traditions, often summarized by historians as walad, a term indicating a slave woman who bore a child to her master, illustrates a grim logic. In some contexts, a child born to a slave woman and her master could alter the child's social position, sometimes granting a path to manumission for the mother, but more often the child was absorbed into the master's social world. The children's names, language, religion, and cultural affiliation were all subject to transformation. Over generations, these children and their descendants could be indistinguishable from the broader populations of their new societies. That assimilation is part of the erasure. People continued, but under different names and as members of different lineages. effectively severing the living thread that connected them to their ancestral communities. Consider what assimilation looks like in human terms. A mother from the Sahel, taken as a teenager and sent across the ocean, might name her child in a new tongue, teach them the prayers of a different faith, and watch them integrate into a household that will keep no records of her village name or clan. If she survives, she may become a private person within a larger family, her origins receding into stories she cannot pass on intact. If she dies, her children will not return to sing her songs or to sit under the tree where her mother told tales. The memory dissolves, not because the person ceased to exist, but because the social markers that maintain memory were stripped away. In many cases, therefore, the social disappearance of a community's people occurred while many of those people were alive. We should pause to ask, does this make the suffering worse than death? That is a troubling, provocative phrase, and it must be handled with care. We do not mean to rank pain, or to say one group's suffering invalidates another's. What we mean is specific. Death ends an individual life. Erasure, as practiced through these slave trades, aimed to put a stop to ancestry, to the transmission of names, languages, and traditions. It aimed to deprive whole communities of their ability to recognize descendants decades later. In that sense, systematic erasure threatens not just the person, but the possibility of communal memory. The stories that allow families to say, "We were here," and to pass obligations, names, and knowledge forward.
A forced conversion, the absorption of children into foreman families, the removal of men's reproductive capacity, all these mechanisms could leave no living trace of whole lines. That is the claim behind the title, a contextualized, morally urgent assertion that the trade's objective effects included the creation of absence as an outcome. Markets made that absence more likely. Cities such as Cairo and Zanzibar became nodes through which captives were funneled, examined, priced, and sold. In Zanzibar, for instance, accounts from the 19th century describe a bustling economy where captives from the interior were offloaded and parceled out to buyers who valued different attributes for different roles. Ottoman markets, too, included sellers who specialized in certain types of human labor, agricultural work, urban servitude, or palace service. Buyers were not uniform in their intentions. Some sought reproductive labor, others sought domestic skills or military service. The consequence was a sorting process that determined not just immediate fate, but long-term cultural trajectories. Children born into an Ottoman or Arabian household were reared within those societies' languages and religions. Over decades and generations, the presence of African ancestors could become obscured by complete social integration. The line of descent would still exist biologically, but its memory and cultural continuity would be reconfigured or lost from the vantage of the person's original community. Eyewitness testimony provides vital texture to these processes. European explorers, missionaries, and colonial administrators who encountered the routes, markets, and survivor communities often recorded what they saw. David Livingstone, for example, described the movement of people along East African coasts and the devastation visited upon inland communities by raiding and trading. Heinrich Barth and Gustav Nachtigall documented markets and the effects of the traffic in North and West Africa. These observers were not unbiased. They wrote through their own lenses with the assumptions and blind spots of their era. Yet their descriptions, when read carefully and critically alongside African oral histories and archaeological evidence, offer corroborating details: caravan death on the routes, markets organized by ancient sects, and the presence of children whose origins were difficult to trace. Archaeologists have in places found physical evidence of mass graves in abandoned camps along main routes, providing a grim material corroboration of accounts of high mortality on the road. One of the starkest differences between the Atlantic and the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trades is the visibility of descendants. The Atlantic system created, over centuries, populations in the Americas whose African identities persisted in language, music, religion, and names, a visible, traceable continuity that anchors public memory and political recognition.
The other trades produced far fewer visible, cohesive diasporas identifiable by a single African cultural signature. That does not mean that people with African ancestry did not exist in the Middle East, North Africa, or South Asia. They did. but their assimilation into broader societies, the reformation of identity through conversion, marriage, and naming practices, and the decimation of male lineages through castration, combined to make their African origins less visible and less acknowledged in the public record. Where diasporic communities and monuments exist for the Atlantic trade, in museums, in the Americas' demographic statistics, in families tracing their roots, such markers are comparatively rare for millions taken into the Sahara and across the Indian Ocean. In other words, the trade succeeded in its goal of erasure, not by annihilating people entirely, but by making their continuities hard to detect. That absence has consequences for memory and accountability. Public memorials, museums, and academic curricula are shaped by what is visible and traceable. The Atlantic trade has a clearer archival footprint in part because of the documentation produced by plantation economies, by the movement of millions to New World colonies, and by the political structures that later confronted and debated slavery's history. By contrast, the dispersed, often domestic locations of enslavement in the Islamic world, households, harems, palaces, and private estates, tended to leave fewer public documents and fewer physical sites that map easily into a narrative of collective memory. Archival silence is not evidence of lesser crime. Rather, it is a dimension of the erasure itself. We must also reckon with the human stories within this black hole of memory. Imagine again a woman, call her Amina, a fictive composite whose life stands for many. Amina is taken from a riverside village after a nighttime raid. She is marched with a group of captives toward a desert town where she is sold to a household master. She bears a son. The son grows speaking the household's language, observes prayers that are not those of Amina's forebears, and takes a name he learned from his owner. Amina's brother, if he survives, may remain in his village, shouting his sister's name into the night to no avail. Generations later, Amina's descendants are citizens of a different city, practicing customs that incorporate bits of many traditions. There is continuity in the biological sense, but the line of memory that would have bound them to Amina's kin in the Sahel is severed. That severance is what we mean by erasure as social extinction. At the same time, the record shows resistance and resilience. Captives ran away. They formed their own communities. They retained, in subtle ways, aspects of their original cultures, food, rhythmic patterns, crafts, that later scholars can detect.
But the scale of absorption and the policies that incentivized reproductive extraction meant that resistance, however real, did not always translate into preserved communal memory in places of origin. Where descendants persisted visibly, their presence has often been marginalized or ignored in national histories. Where physical remains are found in archaeological digs, they are sometimes treated as anonymous victims rather than traceable lives with names and stories. We must be precise in attributing responsibility. The practices we have described emerged from networks that included traders, state actors, intermediaries, and buyers across different societies. Some actors sought profit, some sought labor, some desired political tools, such as eunuchs for courtly tasks. Many African leaders and merchants participated. Many North African, Ottoman, Arab, and other buyers shaped demand. This was a system of many hands and many motives, not the act of a single monolithic group. That complexity does not mitigate moral culpability. Rather, it complicates how we understand accountability and how we form historical memory. We must avoid easy moralizing that flattens historical actors into identities across a millennium. Evidence for the human toll is not confined to textual accounts. Archaeological operations and forensic studies in regions along major routes have uncovered mass burial sites, collapsed encampments with the remains of bones mixed among the detritus of travel, and layers of ash and refuse around former market towns. Such finds corroborate the high mortality on routes and the abandonment of captives during journeys. In some cases, local oral histories preserve fragments of these events, stories of villages emptied, of family lines that ended in a generation. Together, these sources create a composite picture, a commerce-driven system that normalized death and engineered the dissolution of cultural continuity. So why say worse than death? Because death, however tragic, can sometimes be part of a remembered story. It can be named on a grave marker, preserved in a family tale, fixed in a community's liturgy. Erasure, by contrast, aims to remove the possibility of that remembrance. When a practice is designed to prevent descendants, or to ensure that children are absorbed and renamed, it effectively prevents a community from ever reclaiming its lost members in living memory. It is the difference between an unmarked grave and the disappearance of every trace of the person's social and familial identity.
That qualitative distinction is the moral force behind the phrase, not a competition of suffering, but a spotlight on a particular horror that targeted the continuity of people's names, languages, and lines. This is not merely academic. The present-day absence of memorials, the scarcity of public discourse, and the lack of institutional recognition for these victims have real consequences.
Communities whose ancestral lines were severed have less leverage to demand recognition or reparative justice. Histories that might have informed contemporary relations remain unspoken, and the silence itself becomes part of a continuing injustice. Remembering these lives is not an exercise in guilt, but in moral responsibility, to reconstruct the stories the trade intended to obliterate, and to restore dignity to lives the record has rendered anonymous. What does remembrance require? First, careful scholarship that stitches together oral histories, archaeological data, and archival fragments, while treating victims as people, not mere statistics. Second, public acknowledgement in museums, education systems, and commemorative practices that include the trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trades alongside the Atlantic trade within the broader history of slavery. Third, a commitment to name and dignify where names exist, to publish the fragments of stories, to map routes, to mark sites of massacres and abandonment with memorials that resist forgetfulness. This is a work of salvage and of moral repair. We can begin by telling stories with care and precision, by honoring representative lives like Amina's, by acknowledging the dual mechanisms of biological and cultural erasure, and by refusing the easy solace that they are gone so we cannot know. We can look for evidence in bones uncovered in deserts and riverbanks, in the ledgers of coastal markets, in the notes of travelers who were shocked and sometimes complicit in their silence. We can teach these histories in classrooms, include them in curricula, and insist that museums and monuments reflect the full range of human suffering wrought by forced migration and enslavement. If you watched this far, share this video and tell us in the comments which forgotten history you think we should explore next. Remember, remembering is a first step toward justice. We close with a deliberate act of memory. Imagine briefly a ledger that includes not prices and pounds, but names, dozens, hundreds, thousands of names, each tied to a village, to a mother, to a sister. For most of the people taken across the Sahara and into the Indian Ocean, those names are lost to us now. But we can act as a kind of communal ledger. We can speak their stories aloud, teach them, and mark the sites where the winds used to carry the sound of chains. Saying a name aloud is a small and fragile kind of restitution. It is also a moral standing against a system that wanted silence. The claim in the title, that what this trade did to many African women was worse than death, is not a provocation for shock alone. It is a call to recognize a specific form of historical violence, the intentional, structural destruction of lineage and memory. To name that violence is not to rank suffering, but to insist we refuse to let erasure be its final achievement. We owe these women and their communities more than silence.
We owe them names, history, and our attention.